Hi, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. My name is Glen Weyl, and I want to talk today about the powerful role that I believe data cooperatives can play in creating a fairer and more effective data economy, and the ways in which I hope I can, and all of my colleagues at Radical Exchange can partner with you all at the Korea Data Agency to make that a reality. I think the fundamental problem that data cooperatives try to address is the fact that at once, the data economy is scary and overwhelming. So we have increasing fears about the way in which surveillance is being used by authoritarian states and by private companies to keep track of so many aspects of our lives, manipulate us for either the profit motive, advertisements, etc., or for government purposes, and maybe even to replace our jobs in labor markets. So on the one hand, many of us are deeply uncomfortable with the current data economy. On the other hand, there are huge opportunities that this world of big data and the machine intelligence that it brings with it opens for us. So some examples are that there are increasing capacities of these artificial intelligence or machine learning, whatever you want to call them, systems to detect breast cancer and other diseases. They have increasing capacities to help us keep track of air pollution and climate change and to find ways to address some of the most critical problems facing the planet. They're being used for artistic creativity. For example, there's an artist named Holly Herndon who has brought together a group of musicians who would usually be part of a band into a single unified sound using models trained on each of them singing. And probably my favorite example is that in Taiwan, they've used really impressive artificial intelligence type tools, in particular natural language processing and statistical clustering, to facilitate the capacity of people to deliberate on critical issues of the day in real time with millions of people involved, rather than just, in the past, we could only imagine deliberative democracy happening in a small group, maybe a set of representatives. That's why we have representative democracy. What Audrey has shown is that it's possible to do this for thousands or even millions of people at a time using some of these tools. So on the one hand, data economy is something that many people are worried about. We don't want the world that it's offering. At the same time, the data economy has the potential to offer some of the greatest improvements in human life that we've seen in areas ranging from the humanitarian to the creative to the democratic. So it's just not an option for us to simply say, okay, let's regulate away or let's shut down as much of this practice of using data to create valuable services as possible. We want the things that data can empower us to create. And even if we didn't, it would be almost impossible to keep up with techno-authoritarian countries like China that are increasingly using these tools to build more sophisticated services for their citizens if we don't find a way to leverage the same things. As a result, it's just not feasible for us to take a purely Luddite attitude where we just try to shut down what feels like an exploitative set of practices. Instead, we need to find a way to actually transform these practices into something that's even more productive and serves people better. And this has precedent in the 19th century when the initial labor movements were in many ways opposed to a lot of the technical progress, to the replacement of humans with machines, but those were eventually transformed into a labor movement that was critical to actually fueling the growth of the industrial economy during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Doing that, however, requires recognizing some of the special characteristics of data that make them not easily adaptable to simplistic ways of thinking about how they're managed. First of all, data are non-fungible and also non-rivalrous. That means that data from one person is not just more data, it's data that's specific to that person. And yet those data about that person need not be used just by one company. It's not like one person's use of it prevents others from using it. It can be used by many people at the same time. At the same moment, data are not just individual specific. They're not just personal data. Most data are interpersonal. So for example, a classic piece of data in the US and probably many other places that you give about yourself is your mother's date of birth. But of course, my mother's date of birth is also my mother's date of birth, and it's also my sister's mother's date of birth. And almost any data you can talk about have this property. Emails exchanged between people, social media exchanges are properties of many people and not just one person. So data are networked and interdependent. And finally, data aren't just there to be picked up. They're not just laying on the ground. They're not just buried somewhere. They're actually the product of human interaction, work, collaboration, and labor. They come from the things that we do and the people that we are. And if they don't respect that, they both undermine our rights and they aren't going to work as well, because anything that comes out of human creativity and effort will be most impactful if it empowers those people to contribute to that process. And all these together mean that both the standard sort of private property approach and the purely government-based or regulatory approach are not going to be very effective in managing data. Why? Well, if you try to treat data as private property, then everyone would have a right to sell the data relevant to them. But because any given datum is relevant to many people, you'd create a race to the bottom where every person is trying to sell the data. And in the process, whoever's willing to pay the least will end up setting the price for all of those people. And all those people's privacy will be undermined by the one least scrupulous person willing to sell it. So private property is not a compelling way to think about data. On the other hand, governments are not a particularly useful vehicle as primary managers of data, because they're geographically bound in ways that are not all that relevant to many of these forms of creation and many of the externalities that follow. So let's go back to my examples. Think about breast cancer. Breast cancer is not bound by national borders, right? Breast cancer afflicts people all over the world, and the data that are going to be useful for training a breast cancer prediction model will therefore be data from people all around the world and who all have a stake in how those data are used. Climate change and most environmental problems don't follow national boundaries. Many bands and artistic creation is no longer a national phenomenon. And for all of these reasons, if you just had nation states collectively manage data, they would probably do just as much violence in many ways to those networks of interdependence as private property would. And at the same time, they would be sort of clunky and ill-adapted to dealing with data that are created in communities. They would not allow for the kind of innovation that you would want. So what's the alternative we propose? Well, it's already starting to emerge from communities around the world, and it's called the data cooperative model. So as an example, in Taiwan, many people have what are called air boxes, little sensors in their houses that detect the particulate matter in the air. And under a program called the Airbox Data Cooperative, created at the university, at the Taiwan National University, I believe, they built a cooperative organization where citizens pool together this information and share it with each other, and then use these data not just for their collective benefit and to do analyses and to make demands for environmental change, but actually as a bargaining chip with the government and with corporations, where they'll give access to these data in exchange for those corporations taking actions to mitigate the problems or for the government installing some of these boxes in public properties and then sharing the data back to the cooperative. So they used the pooled data that they're all creating as a foundation for collective bargaining. Something similar is happening in driver's seat, a cooperative of ride-sharing drivers, where they use their own access to their driving data to form algorithms that they can use to create a cooperative version of ride-sharing applications, rather than allowing the ride-sharing platforms to take those data and create a platform that abuses their labor rights. There are also co-ops that are working on health, sharing data in order to help cure diseases that afflict them and their families, and then bargaining with drug developers to share those data in exchange for fair and equitable access to the drugs developed based on them for their families. And finally, there's increasing attempts to use credit unions, which are often mutual cooperative organizations, as a foundation for sharing financial data rather than allowing banks, traditional banks, or credit card companies or speculators to become the primary repositories for financial innovation. So the basic idea here is that an individual would join many data coalitions relevant to different aspects of their lives, and that the government would provide support for these data coalitions to ensure that in order to access individuals' data, the platforms would have to bargain with these legitimate fiduciary, democratically controlled representatives of the participants. These data coalitions would give individuals the strength and in numbers that they need to bargain effectively with the platforms, and the expertise to understand how their data are being used. And at the same time, they would offer a single point where platforms can go get access legitimately to these data. They would potentially bargain over both financial and non-financial terms, how the data was being used, how it respected privacy, but also ensuring that if it is being used in a thoughtful and privacy respecting way, that a chunk of the value comes back to those participating in the system, so they have an incentive to provide higher quality data that will lead to more effective services. And you can imagine someone, for example, being part of one co-op for their music. Imagine someone's a musician, and they also have a rare disease, and they'd be part of a health co-op for their rare disease. They'd be part of a financial data co-op to manage their finances and give them insights about it. And they might be part of a social media co-op for their life in social media. And all of these would be at a scale that would allow them to be effective bargaining partners to get the sort of participation that they want from platforms, and to provide a financial income stream to them in things that they do want to be involved in. Now, there are increasing numbers of tools, both technical and legal, that can empower this sort of a world to come into existence. On the technical side, there is a procedure called federated learning, which is part of a broader suite of things called privacy-preserving machine learning, which allow people to keep their data local and to have the person creating the model, the infrastructure, maybe the data co-op or the platform that it's interacting with that's trying to train a model, send the model down to the phone or computer and have it be trained on the computer and then send it back up to the cloud. So that rather than data being alienated, data being sent into this pool or platform in a way that could affect privacy, instead, only the insights that come out of those data are shared and turned into a product that the cooperative can collectively benefit from, or that the platform can benefit from in contract with the cooperative. I encourage everyone to learn about these really powerful tools. They're being developed by many people, but among them is OpenMind, a really cool sort of data co-op of its own. It's a open source software project that's building tools that empower these things. which is recognized by the United Nations. And they have a wonderful educational series called the Private AI series that I encourage you all to look at. It's especially made for policymakers. There's also legal tools that we need, because we need to define what a data cooperative is and to ensure that data cooperatives actually satisfy the responsibilities that they should have of democratic accountability to their participants, of fiduciary duties, of the ability to make claims on each other if one data co-op reveals data that pertains to the members of other data co-ops, to ensure that they can't infringe each other's rights. And we've drafted a moot piece of legislation called the Data Freedom Act at Radical Exchange that has influenced similar pieces of legislation in Europe and in Taiwan. And we'd love to work with folks at the Korea Data Agency to think about what this would look like in your context. I hope that this is a beginning of a cooperation between you all. We've been cooperating with people around the world. We have 100 local groups around the world that are working on things related to this. We've been involved in artistic projects that help people imagine their participation in the data economy, including one that was at the Shed recently in New York City. There are entrepreneurs like Shiv Malik who are building businesses to empower this sort of data cooperative. And there's all sorts of academic research going on how to make it possible. And together with you all, I believe that we can build a much fairer and more effective data economy. Korea was a pioneer in ways to involve people cooperatively in the creation in the industrial economy. There was a man named Deming who came from the United States to Korea and Japan and helped build up the industrial models there based on getting people involved in improving the quality of products at every stage of production. And in the same way, we need to get people involved in the data economy if we want to have a truly effective digital economy. And I'm looking forward to finding ways that together we can make that a reality. Thank you.